So we measured up the building and we related that to the property boundaries. And from there we found that the house was indeed half a metre to a metre extending into the neighbour's property. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host Harry, Macpherson-Wood, and on today's show we're going to be looking at property boundaries and how surveys define them. Probably not many of you have thought about your property boundaries, and I bet Bob the Builder was one person in particular too. We recently, just this year in 2023, had a client come to us with a problem. So Bob was a builder. He was building a house at a new subdivision, and what Bob was doing was offsetting this house based on the property boundaries. So we'll say the house offset was 4 metres off the front boundary and 1 metre off a particular side boundary. So our builder did as per that. He found the survey pegs on site to define where the property boundary was, set his string line and offset the house. And they built the house, and it wasn't until the fencer had to come on site to try and put it in that side boundary fence between the newly built house and the one that was already built, and couldn't do it. The fence was going to go straight through the house. Couldn't quite figure out what was going on, so what they did was ask a surveyor, which was us, to come out on site and see what's going on. So we measured up the building and we related that to the property boundaries. And from there we found that the house was indeed half a metre to a metre extending into the neighbour's property. So not a very good scenario to be in for that builder. And yeah, we had to then offer our advice on what the next steps are from there, which ended up being a boundary realignment. So don't be like Bob the Builder and find that you build your house in someone else's property. You want to do this right. So the mistake that Bob had made was the property boundary was on a curve on the corner of a property, and right next to where the intersection of the two adjoining properties, the surveyors put in a peg, but there's also a tangent point for that curve very close to it, maybe about a metre off from where this adjoining property line was. And the builder had put their string line on the tangent point and not the boundary corner. And then from there, offset the house a certain distance, which then had it skewed on a certain angle, which meant it poked into the neighbouring property. So not a very good situation to be in. But not saying it wasn't resolved, we were able to resolve it, just a little bit more costly than what they would have liked. So what Bob could have done was get the title or the boundary title plan and look at that and compare those distances on the title plan. To show your property boundaries, there's usually a bearing and a distance defining each line, and from there easiest thing to do is pull out a tape measure, measure a distance between each of those pegs to then define which peg is for which part of the property boundaries. And this would have then, hopefully, the builder would have then been able to figure out that the distance between the two corners or the two bends where the property boundary line was a little bit longer to the tangent point, and maybe had a look around to see where this other peg might have been, which was still there. It was just grass had grown over it a little bit, and usually pegs are marked. They're a little timber peg with a point that's buried or driven into the ground, usually a little bit protruding out of the ground, so it's like a square or a rectangle peg. depending on which state you're in. And next to those is what we call a stake, which is kind of like a marker post, really. It sticks out of the ground, maybe half a metre or so, and it lets people know that there is a peg here somewhere. You've just got to move some grass to get to it. And in this situation, the stake was lying on the ground. So the builder didn't see that there was a peg there and used the wrong peg, which is not ideal. So this led me to the next question on how property boundaries are defined. So as you can see here, I've got a really old surveying instrument. From the research that I found, it was built, or it was made back in the 1880s, so over 100 years old, and this is what surveyors use to help them define where property boundaries are. Today's equipment is essentially the same thing. What this thing does is measure an angle, and the angles are here, both horizontal angle and vertical angle, and from there you can set a reference or a datum line and then turn angles, and then you have a difference from those two angles to then be able, from between two marks, you've got an angle difference, and then what the surveyors did was pull out a chain between the 2 points and measure a distance. So essentially a bearing and a distance, just like on your title plans where they have for each of the boundaries a bearing and a distance. And what surveyors do is we place marks near these title boundaries and reference a bearing and a distance from the survey mark to the boundary, and then the boundaries are then calculated. So today's equipment a little bit more advanced than this one. What we have are more accurate ways of measuring angles. We use electronic ways of doing it, as well as a distance, which is a laser. So we're essentially doing the same thing as turning an angle and measuring a distance with a chain, but it's all electronic with angles, more precise angles and more precise distances. And basically from there, it's just trigonometry to figure out bearings, distances, angles and areas, and there you have it. You can create boundaries and have them referenced on plans. As technology has evolved, we have advanced from theodolites and chains to what we call now a total station, which is basically the total of the angles and the distances. It's just everything all in the one setup. And we also do have GPS or GNSS, which often people think these tripods, this will sit on a tripod, or our total stations will sit on a tripod, and we can measure angles and distances from there. People think that does have GPS, or that's how we measure using GPS, but it's a less accurate way of doing it. We use GPS probably in the larger scale property boundaries, like maybe rural boundaries, where using a total station over a GPS, the accuracy over such a large area doesn't become quite as necessary. Where we're talking a bit more fine-tuned, smaller boundaries and more precise measurements needed, we use total stations, but otherwise we can use GPS for the larger sites. Same methodology, but the GPS has satellites to pinpoint a position, and we can measure the two survey marks, and then they reference into boundaries. So that is essentially how your property boundaries are determined on site. It's not always the case where there are survey marks near the boundaries, and sometimes you have to try and find other survey marks or other plans that reference marks, and sometimes there aren't marks at all, and there are different ways of determining how your property boundaries are in these situations, and that's where it can become quite complex, and following legislation is really important. But the main principle of surveying is the survey marks define the property boundaries, and that's how surveyors can then put it in those timber pegs to define your property boundaries. Not always are they timber pegs. Sometimes they could be concrete or a nail placed in the concrete. Nail or larger nails, different types of nails. We can put punch marks in fences. We can put these aluminium rivet lugs. I usually drill a hole and then bang it into the concrete and it flattens out the rivet. And a few other various marks. The typical is a survey peg, which is a hardwood timber square in Victoria, rectangle in New South Wales, depending on which state, but essentially the same thing, just the dimensions change a little bit from what this peg looks like. And next to the peg is a stake, which is the marker post for the boundary or the peg. Sometimes, maybe older properties, it's a bit harder to tell where your boundaries are, or maybe even the fences don't quite align with the property boundaries, or you're not too sure. This is where the surveyor or a licensed surveyor really becomes important, as licensed surveyors or registered surveyors, depending on the state, are the only person qualified to determine where your property boundaries are. So if you have any concerns about your property boundaries, or maybe you're thinking of subdividing or consolidating land, or a strata, a community title, or a building subdivision, anything to do with property boundaries, the person to speak to is a licensed surveyor. Or if you have any questions relating to boundaries or survey or instruments or anything like that, please send the message through and I'll be sure to help. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.